Cyberpunk TCG is officially the most funded TCG in Kickstarter history. At the time of recording, they have raised over $15 million. However, in the same week, the second most funded TCG in Kickstarter history is shutting down. Altered has called it quits. We wanted to take a minute to compare and contrast the Cyberpunk TCG and the Altered TCG and see what can we learn from the situation.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so we've kind of split up our analysis into 3 sections where we're going to talk about these categories for each game. We're going to have a little bit of a gameplay analysis of both games. We're going to have kind of a product design analysis of both games, and then how they've both sort of interacted with their community. This is crowdfunding after all, but TCGs have kind of a special relationship with their community that is a bit more complicated than many other games do.
So very quick summarization of Altered. Goal of the game, race to win various rounds of gameplay to meet one of your tokens with another token. That sounds really confusing and not like a trading card game, but trust me, it is. Players take turns playing one card from their hand in a sort of priority passing order to either the left lane of the field or the right lane of the field. Unit cards that you play commonly to the left or right lane will have 3 various stats. You will compare your stats from your units to the opponent's unit stats in the same lane as you at the end of each round. And if you have stats that are higher than your opponent's stats, then you will move your token ever so closer to the other side of
meeting up with your buddy in the middle of the board.
It's touted as a non-combat game, so it's not so much about you trying to fight your opponent as much as it is exploring this land, and you're trying to meet up with your other companions who are also exploring the land. Which is where you get the left and right lanes. At the end of each round, both players will send any units that they played that are on the board to what's called the reserves, where they can eventually be sent back out for an alternate mana cost on their next turn, but with something called fleeting, meaning that they're just going to kind of go away. They for sure go to the graveyard after that. Otherwise, everything else can be pretty summarized to pretty standard TCG stuff as far as mana system goes. You play cards for mana, you tap mana to play these cards, yada, yada, yada.
The biggest issue, I think, in the situation with Altered was board complexity. And this becomes a even bigger problem when you're trying to sort of like pitch a game to new players, because if they can't really parse the information that they need to get to the critical decision points, they tend to kind of players tend to have a hard time engaging with that kind of a game. With Altered here, the biggest sort of board complexity issues are that every card has multiple like 5 stats that you need to familiarize yourself with, which they basically have like a power stat that is relative to 3 different biomes. And so a card could have like a 3 in the desert biome or a 2 in the mountains. And I think those are the biomes. I don't remember. Mountains, desert,
forest, and ocean.
Okay, sure.
Something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. So there's there's like 3 different stats they could have based on the biomes. And then they also have 2 different mana costs. They have the mana cost to actually deploy them from your hand, and then they have the mana cost to deploy them from the reserve zone, which is after they've been deployed once, and then they could be deployed again. But then there's also the critical decision points of what am I deploying from my hand? What am I turning from my hand? What am I turning into resource, right? Putting face down as a resource card. What am I playing from my reserve? Where am I playing it whether it's the right or left of the field? And how do each of those stats affect that decision? And the thing that I found myself struggling with Altered systems was just getting into the habit of doing that entire analysis before making a decision. And then the decision that needed to be made for me felt fairly simple at that point.
Yeah. Oftentimes when we do our sort of deep analysis on games like this, we really try our best to streamline it and get as bare bones mechanics, if possible, no mechanics whatsoever, so that we're really understanding what's happening at a systems level. And I think when we finally started having all of that stuff click for us, we were recognizing that like overall the decisions that you were making of whether you're going to the left or right didn't actually have that deep of an analysis, but it was very difficult to figure out what the right answer was because of all of these different possible outcomes, because of all the different possible numbers. I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about a whole lot about Altered is that it's actually, ironically, I think makes the board state more complex when you have no growth to the board state. The way that Altered is different is that you'll play cards to the field, and then at the end of the round, cards will either go to the reserve or they'll go to your graveyard. but cards don't stay in those lanes permanently, not like in something like Riftbound. And so because cards are constantly coming and going, you don't have this opportunity to sort of offload information and slowly understand the changing, shifting tide of the board state. Instead, it's a brand new board state every single time. It's new information that you have to try and memorize. And it becomes more complex in that way.
The other thing with Altered's gameplay that I felt was sort of difficult was they have the alternating action system, which is like I play something, you play something, and they didn't really do anything to create tension in the system to stop you just playing like your lowest investment unit, right? So it was like I play my smallest unit, you play your smallest unit, play the smallest units until we've exhausted that pattern, until you start playing your bigger units that actually have a bigger impact. And so there wasn't really any tension there in terms of like why you would want to play. You wouldn't want to always just play your lowest impact units first. And I think that kind of removes some of that decision making that I'm talking about that becomes more strategically interesting. I can offload the sort of interesting sequencing decision making too. I'm just going to play my cheapest stuff first. But then the complexity comes in with like, where am I going to play it, and what are the impacts of where I'm going to put it throughout the entirety of the rest of my turn, right? Like it's a crunchy, complex, mathy kind of problem rather than a strategic one for me. So one of the big sells for Altered 2 was the fact that it was sort of pitched as a non-combat TCG, right? That you're sort of just trying to get closer and closer to meeting your companion or whatever in the middle of the board. But in actuality, it ended up really just being a game of comparing numbers. And so for me, it felt like it was still kind of a combat game, right? It was still a very head-to-head, like we are comparing who has the bigger number here, even though the sort of narrative aspects of it were not combat. It still kind of just did a number comparison thing.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how like 1v1 games are just so inherently competitive that it's really hard to avoid it feeling that way. It's difficult when it's only one thing preventing you from winning, and it's the person across from you, from it not feeling like a competitive game or a combative game in this way. And there's a lot of games that I think will, on the surface, try to say this game is about this, or it has a theme or a conceit in this way or whatever, but ludonarratively, when you're like actually experiencing it, it is a much different experience. Yeah. And I think the last thing on gameplay for Altered that we kind of have is like a little bit of, a knock against it, I suppose. And I guess for us, not everyone feels this way, but is very crufty. We have a video on cruft, but cruft is essentially just lots of extra bits and bobs and pieces that are required in order to play the game. And this one, out of all TCGs, I think probably has the most. Yeah. As far as other TCGs that are currently like on the market that I can think of, Digimon might be like second, and even Digimon doesn't have that much. It has like a memory tracker and a thing in the center and stuff.
Because it needs the memory tracker. It's quite similar to Altered in that way, where there are sort of the different locations. The locations change too in the middle of the field too, which so you just adds another layer of
So a lot of the times when you're like bringing a card game or something, sometimes those crufty pieces could be changed for something else, right? A token could be represented by a die or something like that. You can keep track of life totals on a scratch piece of paper, but in this, you actually have to have their cards for the lane in the center, and then you need tokens to represent your thing and your opponent's thing. You need tokens to represent fleeting, because fleeting is something that the system is actually creating in this, not mechanics creating it. So lots of things to track.
Right. And honestly, I think to sort of wrap up the gameplay portion of this for Altered, it does feel a lot like a TCG designed by somebody that would normally design board games, which is exactly what this was, right? It was I think the lead designer on this was the same guy who did the board game Seasons, which is, cool game. But when you start to take some of those sort of design sensibilities and move them into the TCG space, I think the best way to sort of compare these two is that board games tend to be more systems heavy and TCGs tend to be more mechanics heavy, and that the main sort of system of a TCG should be basically as simple as possible, because you're going to add so many cards that are going to change up that system and bring that complexity, where board games often at a systems level end up being more complicated, because you just kind of have that one box that you're handing to players and saying, all right, here's your the longevity of how long you're going to play this game is held basically within that box. Maybe you add in some with expansions, but generally speaking, you need to have a lot for that player to do in a singular given box, because the product model works substantially differently.
Yeah, and it's really important, I think, to have a simple system because, like you said, the mechanics that are sort of intertwined in the TCG because of the customization of it, like things can implode so easily. Magic has imploded several times in its history. Many card games have done this. And so even with a simpler system of a card game, like this still can potentially have this outcome. And so the more complex the system becomes, the harder it is to track exactly like where these sort of pain points might be and what to watch for.
Okay, so let's move on to how Cyberpunk's game system works.
All right, so very quick summarization of Cyberpunk. Goal of the game is you have to start your turn with at least 6 dice in your gig area. We'll talk about the gig area. I guess gigs are just what your dice become.
Just what your dice represent, basically. Yeah.
So players start the game with 3 face-down legend cards. These are kind of like commanders that can also be used as your resource or mana, or be brought out or played later on in the game. Each turn you may play 1 card from your hand that has a resource symbol into your resource pool. It's very similar to Lorcana if you've played that. Players start each turn by taking a die to roll and move it into their gig area. And then everything else is fairly traditional TCG stuff, where you play out units, you play not sorceries and instants, but kind of sorceries and instants, and other card types like that. And if a player were to attack another player directly, they would steal a gig from that player. However, you gain an additional gig for every 10 plus attack that a unit has when it attacks directly. So you could get technically all the gigs in one hit if you have
like a 60, 70. Yeah.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, I think something I'm noticing about Cyberpunk systems is that they are more simple and feel designed more along the lines of what you would expect out of a TCG system. The other thing that I notice about Cyberpunk systems is they do have some potentially problematic decisions, but they are things that would be uncovered later, right? So the initial systems for newer players are going to feel pretty easy to pick up, pretty easy to understand. And then any of the sort of potential pitfalls that we're noticing are going to happen later on when you start to sort of strategically analyze the game. And so I think in terms of getting new players to pick this game up, they're in a much better position than what Altered was, because that complexity or sort of those hiccups are going to be happening later on.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that picked up Altered really liked the innovation that they were attempting for the card game genre. And I think a lot of people that are picking this up, they're kind of taking the Bandai Namco model, I feel like, where they're changing just a little bit. We kind of framed it as like, it seems like 80-20 that they're changing, where it's just about 20% different, 80% the same. It's really easy to kind of pick this up if you're used to other trading card games that are currently on the market. Since
you play cards from your hand face down as mana, only certain cards can be played this way, and Lorcana has this exact problem where when you only have certain cards that can be played face down as mana, you have to reveal that card first, which is known information, and then it goes face down, which becomes unknown information, which means competitively players have an incentive to want to track that information. So you're basically asking players to write down every time, like what card you played face down as mana, so they can track that, oh, those cards are now out of your deck and face down as mana, so I can sort of check those off from cards that you might have later in the game.
Right. This was something that Lorcana actually, they definitely knew that this was going to be something people did when making the game, and their fix for it was that people couldn't write things.
Yeah, you can't write things down.
Can't write things down.
Write things down.
They might have changed that by now, but when we first did our review of Lorcana, that was their thing.
It was pretty silly. And then the other thing, this is a Riftbound problem too, is that they have introduced sort of a knock-on rule to make sure that the game ends, because you can sort of end up in this stalemate with the system where when you attack the other player, you get to claim some of their dice, and you need 6 dice at the beginning of your turn to win the game. If they didn't have an additional knock-on rule to finish the game, you could just pass those dice back and forth forever and nobody ends the game.
Right. For clarification, it's not like Magic where you can just block with any one unit or creature or anything like that. It's similar, like I said, to these Bandai Namco games that tend to have like blocker cards, dedicated blockers. So if neither of you have blockers and you have the same amount of units or whatever, you're just swinging back and forth indefinitely until hopefully someone gets one extra unit, I guess, to try and break the tie.
Yeah, and the way that they handled that was basically that like once all of the dice, the dice start in your fixer pool, which just basically means they haven't been rolled yet. At the beginning of your turn, you're going to roll one of the dice, which then goes into your gig pool, which just is the dice that have been rolled, and those now are eligible to win the game once you have 6 at the beginning of your turn. But once all players have rolled all dice, this was also a little strange because it's like if you start your turn and you didn't roll any dice, but your opponent still has dice to roll, you pass the turn to them. They would then roll their last dice. And then once your turn starts again, now if you have 7 at any time, you just win the game, right?
No.
No?
No. This is where I think that this extra sort of tacked on rule I think gets complicated is we're talking about the overtime rule. The overtime rule is essentially that if you start your turn and normally when you'd roll your dice, you don't have any dice to roll, then you've essentially initiated when overtime could start, but you haven't started overtime yet. Right. Then you have to pass the turn to your opponent, and then if they start their turn and they didn't roll any dice, then overtime still hasn't started, but once your opponent ends their turn, because both of you didn't roll dice because you couldn't, then you've reached overtime. Now that you're in overtime, anytime any player has 7 or more gig dice, then you win essentially. Yeah. So the problem I have is like you're kind of initiating this brand new phase. It's not entirely clear when that phase gets initiated, and you kind of have to hope that the turns aren't too long or drawn out, or that there isn't something that disrupts that. Otherwise, players could easily forget that they've hit overtime and just have that potential for the indefinite back and forth.
Yeah, it's definitely strange that like in order for the game to end, players have to be aware that they have entered a state that will ensure that the game ends, because that's something that's easily missed. This kind of falls under the category of if a player can't see it, it doesn't exist. That's something that we talk about quite a bit. But yeah, basically this is sort of an additional rule that happens at a certain point in the game, but isn't always there during the game. So you're not thinking about it on each turn. It only comes up at a very certain instance and might not come up at all. So yeah, that's a little tough.
Yeah. I mean, other than that, there's really not a whole lot to knock Cyberpunk for. It doesn't have nearly as much cruft. It does have some cruft. You have to carry stuff of dice with you.
That's the only thing that I would say in terms of cruft is that you need a set of like a D20 set. So D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, D20. You don't need the percentile die, but basically if you play D&D, you're going to have access to these dice. But this in the previous TCG boom was a problem. Like the previous TCG bubble is that there were games that tried to include sort of like D20 like dice in the game, and it ultimately hurt the game. But it might be now that there's enough saturation of players that would have these dice that maybe it's okay. But it also might mean that you need to include this set of dice in all of your products, which is just an additional expense to all of your starter kits. So
did we get dice in this?
Yeah, there's 2 sets in there.
Oh,
actually.
okay, cool.
Yeah, but that's not indicative of what players would be getting.
Oh,
so
right.
That's just the alpha kit. So.
And then the only other thing I think is that thematically, Cyberpunk feels right. Like I think everything it's very flavorful with the words, almost too flavorful at times. I don't know what a fixer is, but
it's the person who gives you your gigs.
Oh, they're like. Oh, it's a person?
Yeah. Ironically, this is the game that would make more sense to have QR codes, but we got there yet.
Right. You should have had barcodes. You scan little barcodes on it or something. That would have been fun.
So next category, we're going to start talking about our product design, which these are decisions that are kind of outside of the gameplay elements of the game, but do have a substantial impact on whether or not the game will succeed. So starting with Altered, some of the product design choices that they made were experimental, let's say. They made some pretty big promises during their Kickstarter campaign in terms of digital collection of these cards. Basically, in Altered, every card has a QR code on the front, which looks really ugly. But the trade-off was basically that you could scan these cards and have a digital collection of cards, and that was where the actual ownership of the cards was, which feels a little NFT flavored, which is not great.
Everyone hated it then too, and I think they did their best to avoid saying anything like NFTs.
Right, and really the goal was not really NFTs exactly.
You have a physical copy of this card. Sort of. Right. So basically they were offering a print on demand service, which basically meant that if you owned the cards digitally, you can print as many copies as you want for like a flat
fee.
Yeah, it means like if you only needed to get one Shieldred the Apocalypse in a pack,
and
then you could print out
infinite
a play set.
Shieldreds.
Yeah.
But the actual ownership of the card was handled digitally. So if you were going to go to a tournament or something, you would have to prove that you owned all the cards in your deck by having some kind of scanning process to register your deck. I don't know. Like, look, it was strange and weird, and also like didn't really even come online until a year or two.
The third set. So I think it's
about a year
first
in.
year. Yeah.
Yeah. So they had sort of pitched this as the idea at the beginning with the first Kickstarter, and then didn't actually get it off the ground until after the first year. Basically.
Yeah. I think we should mention that like it was stuff like this, like the QR codes and the digital collection and all that I think was a big draw for a lot of people with the Kickstarter. Is I think like a lot of what Altered was doing as part of its pitch that worked was that they were doing so many things that were so different, and I think very intentionally was like, this is going against what TCGs commonly do in the market. Yeah. And pointing out like other people can't or won't do this, and we will do this, and it's better for consumers. And I think that while that was all great and like it sounds, I think, really nice, I think in actuality, the way that it was organized potentially led to the downfall of the game. Really. Yeah,
well, and it definitely would have ballooned costs, right? Costs were astronomical for this game. Part of the reason why they went under is because they basically said, hey, we need to raise 2.5 million euros to continue producing this game at all. And they were able to raise $500,000 through their GameFound campaign, but that wasn't enough for them to continue the game. And I think from that perspective, it's like, well, look, you could raise $500,000. Like, you should be able to continue this game. But I think some of these decisions, especially this one with this digital service and keeping this stuff up and going, brought the cost to such an astronomical amount that it just wasn't sustainable when they had a downturn. So to kind of stick with this kind of new ideas for trading card games, they co-opted an idea that is pretty, I guess, fairly recent from Keyforge, which is the idea that you're going to have mechanically unique cards. And Keyforge does this by having an entire deck that is like all of the cards in that deck can only be played in that deck. And so it's almost like you would open a randomized booster pack, but it's a themed deck that's like randomized based on an algorithm that comes up with cards that have some mechanically unique aspects. But you're not, ideally, I guess, or theoretically, you're not supposed to separate those into their own customized decks. It's like you bought the deck that is the deck that you have. Where Altered has individual cards that are altered that can be customized into regular decks that you built yourself.
If I'm not mistaken, something like Soulforge Fusion kind of pushed this concept of Altered like to even more of an extreme, where it's not just these like very, very rare uniques, but it's the majority of cards that are printed that are like that. But and I think it's interesting. The problem here with Altered having these uniques be incredibly rare is that it's not just a one-of-a-kind card that gets printed. Let's say it's a meta-defining card, but now it's printed with an extra bonus. And because of that, I think the wires get crossed between collector and players. And it's kind of confusing who these were supposed to be for, because it's really cool to open. And I think like, as a kid, I would hear something like this and I'd be like, wow, that's really cool. And as an adult that wants to play potentially competitively, I'm like, no, get out of here. I don't want to go and spend potentially several $100s for this mechanically unique card that I absolutely need to be able to play competitively.
Right. And I think there's like an ideal of early Magic that is kind of in the DNA of this idea. I mean, it's Keyforge coming from Richard Garfield, I think trying to recapture some of the things some of the concepts he had from early Magic, which was that no one would have an optimal deck, right? It wouldn't be possible. Like you would have an assorted collection of cards that you have sort of cobbled your deck together with, and it has sort of your identity built into it in that way. You're not playing the most optimal deck possible. But in reality, I think modern TCGs don't really work that way anymore. And so we get a lot of, we're going to come back around to this in sort of the community section here, but because you don't have sort of, the players don't feel the ability that they can play optimally, I think it kind of gives it's another hurdle to getting a game to take off at like a local TCG kind of scene, I think, if you're competitive focused.
Yeah. I mean, the minute someone has a very powerful unique card, which they have an algorithm that's supposedly balanced and making sure that everything's going to be fine. But one of the complaints that they had early on actually is that people would get the unique cards and they wouldn't be good, which was like
that's like the
even
worst
a worst
case. Yeah,
case
it's like
scenario,
the worst case
right?
scenario.
Where some of these uniques would be really good, and then others would be like, oh, this makes this thing worse somehow. So
yeah. Okay. So Cyberpunk wise, what are we seeing from the product design from Cyberpunk?
yeah, I mean, the biggest benefit that Cyberpunk has is that it's an existing IP. And so this is sort of it's not Universes Beyond model, not everything's Universes Beyond, but it's essentially why Universes Beyond is working out, right? Is that if you're using an existing IP, you're going to get a large portion of that audience that maybe is familiar with Cyberpunk, has never played a TCG, or the Venn diagram of Cyberpunk fans and TCG fans together that are going to go and invest in this. It's like a cheat code for an immediate bump of attention. And a built-in audience.
Well, and it's also an indicator to collectors that these collectibles might be worth something. We talked about this with Lego and Magic, and basically there's a sort of collector heuristic that if something is connected to a popular IP, that it's more likely to be collectible. In fact, it might be the only reason why it's collectible in some instances. This lines up with sort of the next part of their product design, I think, in that Cyberpunk does seem to be leaning into collector culture, maybe a bit more than a game that is solely focused on players actually playing the game. And we can see some of this reflected in their Kickstarter tiers, in that part of the reason why they've been able to raise so much money on their Kickstarter is that they have tiers that go all the way up to $8,000. And there's a substantial number of backers who are at the around $200 range, and then a bunch that are at the $8,000 range. And I think that shows us a very clear delineation between people who are probably just interested in playing the game and people who are interested in collecting the game.
Which, in all fairness, because that's probably going to be their biggest issue, is trying to really figure out who's here as a collector versus who's here as a player. It's actually good for them to try and have these very separate tiers that makes it clear which camp you're in. It's not exact data, not going to be precise info for you, but like that's at least something to go off of. And if there's something that I think is admirable about like Altered, is that Altered identified some sort of like an issue in the TCG market, and whether or not their attempt at fixing it actually worked or not, like that was its big selling point. As opposed to Cyberpunk, and I think a handful of other TCGs right now kind of see this issue, but aren't really actively doing much to address it.
Altered also kind of went down this road a little bit with their highest tier being a $5,000 tier. But we can kind of compare these two a bit apples to apples in terms of like what you get for your money.
If we were to compare the two tiers and we took all aspects of each tier that has a very clear retail price, the $8,000 tier still has roughly $1,300 to $1,500 worth of value that is only being associated with the 3 cards that you get.
Very collectible things, theoretically.
Right. One of them is a serialized 1 of 100 card that's like a metal card or something like that. So that's probably the one that is going to be the most value, but they're already sort of speculating that this value is essentially $1,300 to $1,500 because that's what people are investing in.
Right. It's an exclusive metal card, a serialized metal card, and also a pre-graded card. So like pre-slabbed, I guess at 10, I would assume you're getting a 10 if they're pre-graded. I don't know.
Right. If it's not a 10, bummer.
I'd be like, right. What are you sending me?
Yeah.
But yeah, in that way, we're basically saying like, well, you're spending, $1,300 to $1,500 more than what you were on Altered, assuming that these 3 items that you are getting from the Cyberpunk campaign are worth at least that or more. And we that's all speculation at that point.
See, I don't need Cyberpunk where I'm going. I'm going straight to Kabuto land.
What's that worth? Cool $150.
I don't want to talk about
like
it.
$1.50, not $150.
Let's get back to the video.
How much did you spend on it? Let's see. All right, so finally we're going to get to our community category, which this is sort of essential for a TCG, right? The whole ass, like the whole ass. That's right. This is the whole ass. Without community, TCGs don't really work, right? You need a community of people to trade cards with. And I think in this day and age, we're getting a lot of TCGs that I think are kind of ignoring this fact and ending up replacing it with this Kickstarter model or print on demand or generally online marketplaces, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So what did Altered do that we think sort of undercut this sort of community relationship?
Right. I mean, by having the print on demand, with you being able to sort of take a digital ownership of a card and be able to print it out and have that sent to you, or even having the trading happen over that, it bypassed singles that usually you'd go to your local game store to go and purchase. And so instead, there's sort of this, I think, like arbitrary value that Altered or Equinox, the company sort of attached to these cards, saying like, well, you just buy that card and you buy it in print and it's going to be sent to you. This is normally something that you would go to a local game store to go and experience, to go and trade, something like that. And I think even just removing that means that now local game stores can't tack on that additional sort of 30% of value, right? It also sort of kills the secondary market, except for uniques. And uniques is a much tighter, specific demographic. You have to have players that want to be very competitive and invest a lot of money in those.
They sort of have misunderstood the real ecosystem benefits that you get from cultivating a community around the local game store, around basically like players being able to have a place to gather in the first place.
Yeah, I think in particular, especially when your game is a 1v1 game, Commander has sort of alleviated this a little bit, but 1v1 games in particular really need that community to thrive in, because otherwise it's hoping that you have one friend that's willing to play and that they're just as interested in this game as you are, but having a hub that you can go to meet like-minded people and get to experience this, I think is so key for trading card games. I mean, it's either that or make sure you have a digital model that you can, play with digitally. And they didn't have one that was like great. They had one available on Board Game Arena, I think, but not a nice, clean, flashy one.
Yeah, that is interesting. I do wonder if they had taken the money that they ended up spending on the digital side of Altered with the QR codes and the app that they had to scan your cards and all this stuff, and instead put that money towards building a digital version of the game, if that would have been a better choice for them. Yeah. But then you kind of, I don't know, there's a whole nother conversation to be had there as to whether or not digital versions are undercutting your paper TCG stuff, but
which is possible. However, they also had a perfect opportunity and a whole system to generate digital card collections that could then be used in a digital way. So,
well, they only have so many funds to go, look, they raised a ton of money, but it costs a lot of money to make a digital version of something.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Unless, you go the bootstrap route. Okay. So let's talk about Cyberpunk then. What are we seeing from Cyberpunk so far? Obviously, the game is not even released yet, so it's hard to know how they're going to handle the sort of community aspect of things. But what have they said, or what signals have they given to, I don't know, let's read the tea leaves a little bit and see if we can decipher anything in terms of how they're going to respect the community.
Well, we don't even necessarily have to read the tea leaves, because Cyberpunk actually had an article that came out for Kickstarter where I think they maybe interviewed some of the members of WeirdCo, or Kickstarter at least did an analysis of their Kickstarter.
Oh yeah, that's right. They had that article.
And, WeirdCo is claiming to want to be using the Kickstarter or crowdfunding route in order to bypass this sort of collector scalper culture, which sounds really nice in theory, and technically works the first time, at least. It might work a handful of times, but it's not like collectors or scalpers still aren't getting this product. And the real issue is going to be that once it hits the mass market, how is that going to be handled, right? Because right now they're only getting an idea of what they think the demand is, and the demand is really high, but Kickstarters aren't a great example of what actual demand is. It's a big, exciting event. There's lots of people speculating. People see lots of money, therefore collectors are going to get on board and want to also invest that money. But suddenly, if you were to now see Cyberpunk TCG, and it's the first, second, third set or whatever in your local game store, you're not seeing that this was a $15 million Kickstarter campaign. So are you going to see this as an investment as a collector or scalper, or as a player, are you going to be like, wow, cool, like Cyberpunk, when you're not seeing how successful it is?
It's also interesting with Cyberpunk because, like we were saying, there's that really big split between like the $200-ish tiers and the $8,000-ish tiers. And I think they might be able to gauge demand better from looking at the $200 tiers because that's probably more indicative of people that want to play the game. But even then, you could very easily overestimate the amount that people are going to want to buy this game off of a store shelf because you don't have sort of that 30-day fear of missing out incentive for people to buy the game. And so if you overproduce and put it on store shelves, then like out of the gate, you've overprinted and game stores might pick up too many copies of this and then not be able to sell it. And then you've already sort of soured some of your relationship with your game stores.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is a game store could end up buying, let's say several cases or whatever, of the first first set of Cyberpunk because they're seeing how successful the Kickstarter is. But then if it doesn't end up selling, that's going to be what they remember. They're not going to remember that initial success of the Kickstarter, and they're going to think about that the next time they are thinking about buying a case or sets of it or whatever. And like, it could just be entirely possible that locally, no one's attracted to the game. Locally, no one wants to invest the time. No one wants to go and spend their time going and participating in tournaments. And like, if you don't have that community start to grow, then it's going to be much harder for you to be able to continuously try and sell sets in that specific area. Yeah. So right now, I'm imagining they're probably flooded with offers of people wanting to buy, retailers wanting to get in on this first set, but they really won't know what that's going to look like until those sales numbers come in from the retailers.
Yeah, and I think the game that has managed this transition the best is probably Sorcery. They are the third most backed TCG on Kickstarter now, but they have stayed small. They have slowly moved forward with like one set a year and have really started to put a focus on releasing their sets through game stores and put a heavy focus on buying the product from game stores too. So. Yeah.
I mean, the funny, the trade-off here is that like Sorcery is not having these incredibly flashy numbers right now, right? Sorcery is not being talked about. Logan Paul or whoever is not going and buying Sorcery cards.
Hey, you know what? In my book, that's probably a good thing.
But those type of headlines right now in this collector culture is what is really bringing a lot of success to trading card games, right? But it's a quiet success that Sorcery is experiencing, right? They're still coming out with sets. They're doing it in their own time, and they're not having to beg players to spend a certain amount of money to keep the doors open, right? Like, and that's a good sign. And I think that this, I guess, sort of grassroots approach that we talked about several times on here that like is probably the safest, most conservative bet, right? To not assume that just because you had an insanely popular Kickstarter, that's going to translate. It's like a big giant like boost in the beginning, but you still have to like set the groundwork and set the foundation, and people still need to become familiar with you.
You still have to do the work, right? Just because you had this giant successful Kickstarter doesn't directly translate. All right, so what are our takeaways here? What do we think? Given all this sort of information, what's the future look like for Kickstarters and TCGs?
I think it's exciting to see just how big some of these TCGs can get. I like seeing the demand, but I'm concerned how much of this is the current bubble and the collector culture and all that's happening. As a alternative look to this, another TCG that's currently on Kickstarter is YouTuber 10 Hundreds or 10 Huns. No, not sure. Mr. 10 Hun might be
10 Hun,
as he prefers to be called. I think it's currently going live on Kickstarter. Not 15 million, but still another good like quiet success.
It's like
I'd say
300,000 to 400,000 somewhere in there.
And I'd say that's great.
Yeah. I mean, if you're keeping it small and it's kind of a passion project, that makes plenty of sense. You can keep going, but make more sets, build up from there. Allestrals also did something similar.
Yeah, right.
So we are seeing quite a few of these sort of influencer TCGs, I think, come through. There's even like who's he working with? Creo, I think, is who 1000 is working with, which is a company that makes trading card games for influencers. I'm like, what is this? This is a business model, I guess. I don't know. But at any rate, I agree. I think that, we're seeing an ecosystem being created. Like I think Cyberpunk is ultimately a good thing for the space, especially at crowdfunded TCG space, and pushing us closer towards that sort of old school Renaissance role playing crowdfunding space that I think TCGs should start to head into, so that we get these more bespoke games, these more interesting games, these more creative, diverse, innovative stuff, right? Cyberpunk itself, the game's good. It's not taking any huge risks. It's using an established IP, and they're being heavily rewarded for sort of doing that sort of stuff that you would typically think that a crowdfunded TCG should do. But it is bringing more people into the ecosystem, which is ultimately a good thing. And I don't know. I do think that the biggest challenge here is still how do we manage that transition from Kickstarter to Game Store? And that once that can be understood, I think, and if Cyberpunk manages it correctly, I think then we'll really know whether this game's gonna have legs. If you enjoyed listening to us talk about Cyberpunk TCG and how it compares to Altered, please give us a like, maybe a subscribe, and a comment down below.
If you want to continue the conversation, you can find a link to our Discord down below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
And then you have to say bye.
Bye.